Hello everyone, today we talk about the Arab-Islamic Empire between the 7th and the 10th century. This video wants to be just not even an introduction proper, because that would be something impressive even to conceive, but a general consideration on these times and spaces actually in history. Not really strictly, not just materially meant, but still the temporal and territorial dimension here has its own importance, also because it kind of varied over time, and it's difficult as always to find strict, definable boundaries both in time and space, but just a reflection, at least, on why we talk about this period, and especially not really why I do it on Schwerpunkt, but trying to present you what I do, because as you know, by talking about medieval history, I often at least talk about the Islamic world as well, and this is particularly important for me because as a medievalist I grew at least intellectually, with the idea that this Islamic world existed, that it was important, that it was influential, etc. And I sometimes am very surprised how still at this time in history, if you look at, in fact, what mass culture is about in terms of looking at the past, actually things that happened more than 1,000 years ago, such topics are always treated with a let's leave aside ideologism, which is always there in kind of everything we talk about, but with a sort of caution, like saying, I have to justify the reason why I speak about this topic. If I'm from one side, I have to believe in a certain way, or at least to approach the thing from a certain perspective, which is what I'm trying effectively also to do now. I would like to explain a little bit why I talk about Islamic history and what my perspective on the point is. And the only reason why I do this, actually, and which I normally don't do on my videos, as you know, is that when I actually before but also during after the start of Schwerpunkt, it happened to me to give a look, of course, at what exists out here in YouTube or also in the rest of the internet, etc., and looking at how the history of this period is taught. And I'm not talking specifically about Islamic history, but the history of those centuries, including or excluding, as we will see now, that part of Islamic history. And I was struck by one major factor, that is that very rarely, actually, first of all, we take into consideration the Islamic Empire when we study medieval history. But secondly, that when we discuss about it, we always tend to do something dichotomic, like distinguishing the fact, from one side were the Christians, from one side the other side were the Muslims, and it was a sort of a clash fundamentally, and everything revolved around that, right? So that every major phenomenon that you think about, like the Castellation, the Saracen raids, and the Crusades, and so on, are prevalently and dominantly, I would say, interpreted from a strictly religious point of view, or at least a historically religious point of view. That is to say, fundamentally, Christians and Muslims were like cats and dogs, and they always fought against each other, and they were just about destructing each other on the base of religion. This is a concept that naturally is in academies now, nobody actually believes it's the case, but this is, I think if you look past in history, I can't tell you even a work from the last centuries that dealt with medieval history in this perspective, because every historian worth of this title, let's say, doesn't indulge in such cliches, because it's evidently that by knowing even kind of the ABC of the history of these peoples and kingdoms and empires, that effectively things worked on a completely different base, that had a very few to do with religion in itself and much to do with what is always driving effectively conflict and warfare, that is struggle for power in expanding your power with money, etc. For money, actually, with armies, etc. And I've never been quite vocal about this, because I think that every time you touch this issue, everybody goes nuts for some reason, because it is such a deeply rooted, we're so embedded with this, that this is impossible, a prejudice that is very difficultly erasable, let's say, from the mind of people when approaching history. I try to do it because, as a matter of fact, on this channel I don't care anything about this subjective perspectives. I mean, I necessarily need certain narratives to explain things, because this is how our brain fundamentally works, but these narratives are not based on my my intent for pushing from one side or the other, ideologically speaking. As a matter of fact, I don't care. When I speak like now about this, I obviously tend to enter more on that ground, but still I can assure you that my aim is simply trying to take examples like this that you can find at many levels, with other fields of religion, of politics, of other stuff, that there is always, in which there's always a contrast, right, between one side or the other. I can assure you that I don't do it for the contrast in itself at all, but I do it for the sake of going, at least hoping that people can get used to look past behind these things, and to look at at the complexity of history that evidently emerges at all times when you effectively go in depth to things, and you realize that the narratives, simplistic narratives you have been used to, are effectively fairy tale. There is obviously, I speak from one side of the aisle because I am effectively a Westerner. Independently from my beliefs, I still kind of increasingly influenced, and this is obvious. I mean, independently from my beliefs, whether I'm a theist or an atheist, that this doesn't matter. And I believe that naturally I have still a subjective perspective on the matter, and I personally don't have a particular interest in Islamic history for itself. I actually know relatively few about it, nor I have any particular curiosity more than other topics. Obviously, I'm greatly fascinated with it. Every time I read about it, I would like to learn more. But this happens effectively with everything I have. I read and I learn. Looking at and that would like to explain why I'm making these videos, and why the Islamic history playlist now on Schwerpunkt has become so hefty. Not more than others, but still substantial and important in this sense, because I always remember that I make these videos not for because I wake up in the morning and I say, oh, okay, let's talk about this randomly. Yeah, I do choose my topics randomly, but I still have the idea of it's a bit like a game. What comes first, and I let chance deciding. But as a matter of fact, I want to cover all medieval history, at least in this kind of manualistic perspective, because I believe that it can bring good. I read here from the stats, my videos have been watched for like more than 200 days consecutively. Now, it's not really much, but it's still powerful to think that there is someone out there who's been listening to them for so long, and therefore I inevitably expect to have an effect in terms of the contents I deliver and the way I explain things, etc. And when talking about the Arab-Islamic history of the empire, the first hour, let's say, of the caliphate in its prime, in its greatest strength, etc., I always find it extremely important topic, because effectively, not just because of what from the strictly Islamic perspective, like saying how the Islamic world shaped at that time, and how it laid the fundament of what have become still like today in terms of historical development and perspective, but rather for the ways this phenomenon occurred in relation with the local populations, and also the ones that lived outside the so-called Dar-al-Islam, that is fundamentally the Islamic world, let's say, meant, even kind of spatially speaking, as a universal empire that the caliphate was meant to represent. Now, so when we talk about this, we should be amazed, in my opinion, because if you look at it in perspective, basically this happened in less than, I mean, actually in only a bit more than 1 century. From the first decades of the 7th century to the half of the 8th, you find that from the Arabic Peninsula was constituted this new empire that basically accomplished a freaking lot of things. First of all, it effectively extinguished the Persian Empire. It was ruled by the Sassanid dynasty. Secondly, it very seriously weakened the Byzantine Empire. And beyond that, it ended up to extend literally to stretch from Spain to India. So a huge, just think about the geographical dimension. History is not, if you think that in history you can do without geography, it's useless. History and geography should be taught and learned together, because they are meaningless one without the other, at least in terms of strict geography of mankind. At least, especially history is useless without geography. So this enterprise that the early Islamic Empire has been defined in many ways. Some of them are a bit too resounding and excessive. For instance, Brown said that it was said this phrase is actually we were going to comment because it's interesting. I don't actually buy it completely, but it defined the early Muslim expansion as the greatest political revolution of the ancient world. Now, this phrase is very significant, even if you can disagree, as I partly do myself. I hate the concept of revolution in many ways. I don't think the Islamic expansion was a revolution properly meant. It surely was something very different from whichever thing had been seen before. I think that the revolution in itself can be used as a term in this context. Not much for the actual conquest, meant as territorial expansion, military expansion, etc., but rather for the same political nature of Islam that has a completely different, or at least a very different, a substantially different mindset from the other theisms and religions that existed, in fact, in the lands that at least they ended up to expand, and that effectively made the divine rule together with fundamentally the political and military one the same. This is at least ideally the idea. Just think about the concept of the Shari'a, etc. So this is particularly powerful because it was to influence, actually, for I don't know whether for the better, for the worse, the Islamic Empire itself. We will see later that I believe it kind of weakened systemically the caliphate, and it contributed definitely to fragmented, and it's difficult to assess whether it was a cause or a consequence. It was probably saying things, both things at the same time, and I don't believe actually the caliphate fragmented because of this political Islamic political conception, rather because it was kind of necessary given the times of the conquest, the ways, especially the ways that had allowed the Islamic expansion to occur. Now we will see. But another very thought-provoking part of this, and so in terms of the political revolution, is essentially whatever you want to interpret it like. I don't believe it was a revolution, but it's definitely the Islamic conquest brought to this systemic agitation, I would say, of this very vast area of the world that, as a matter of fact, we still see in many ways, and that, historically speaking, never quite came to an end from the Islamic conquest onwards. We will reflect more on this later. But the other very thought-provoking aspect of this story, of this phrase, of Brown's phrase, that I also neither kind of agree with, but it's still important, is the stressing that this was a political revolution of the ancient world. So many of you obviously think that the death of Muhammad in 632 is Middle Ages now, right? Well, there is a huge debate about this. That is a historiographical perspective. We have talked often on Schwerpunkt about how to consider fundamentally the Middle Ages and why we chose certain dates, etc. But there is been in the last decades, I would say, this attention at first of all, naturally diluting and melting the concept of this strict, historiographical subdivisions of history, like that are very didactic. But especially when talking about the Mediterranean dimension and what had been this world stemming from the Hellenic and Roman world, so this still broadly Hellenistic world, best represented before the Islamic invasions by the Byzantine Empire in its essentials. So this continuation of the ancient world effectively came to an end at this point. This is actually a much older conception. Now, the ancient world here that Brown is talking about, I think, includes the idea that effectively the Arabs were expanding was still the ancient world and partly remained into it, so that the transformation towards something medieval, if it ever existed, occurred progressively and only later. But as you know, this is an old concept. I mean, especially with Pirenne, that is incidentally a theory that massively influences great part of the popular attitude towards the role of the Islamic conquests, is that effectively the Arabs brought an end to the ancient world, and not just to that, but to the, for instance, the political and religious unity of the Mediterranean at that point, that it basically destroyed the ancient trade and traffics, because this is what Pirenne believed, which is a very controversial theory, to say the least. From a strictly religious point of view, it is true, of course, the Islamic conquest brought to the Islamization of great parts of the southern Mediterranean shores, and also part of the northern ones. But it's very daring, to say the least, that this was something that effectively broke a real unity of the Mediterranean, if it ever existed. I believe that the concept of the pan-Mediterraneanism, especially also during the Hellenistic times, and at that specific moment of Byzantine history, is a gross approximation in many ways, because effectively the Mediterranean trade had already massively declined. Pirenne was effectively writing that, since you find Byzantine pottery in places like Marseille, you can't say that just before the Islamic advance, you can effectively say that up to the Muslim invasions, the Mediterranean traffics worked since the ancient world, and the Arabs came and broke down. It's absolutely false. And on the contrary, and I made a couple of videos about this, the Islamic invasions, after this first phase of naturally political instability, of conflict, that however was very intermittent, especially in the sea, was accompanied by a revival of trade, because effectively the Arabs put in motion kind of new forces, new energies that they invested also in the Mediterranean. And we talk about Saracen piracy, etc. We can't understand it if we don't understand effectively the trade that was pushing it, the economical interests was behind that, just like the Vikings were doing. It's not that the Vikings were just a bunch of crazies who went around destroying monasteries and slaughtering monks. There were people who were heavily involved in actually intercontinental trade, and the Muslim world was on the lead on that, because simply controlled at that point the trade routes both by sea and land between Europe and the Far East. So what effectively was the Silk Road and the other maritime routes in the south, in the Indian Ocean, etc. So going on, however, this is interesting because it still looks at, always talking about Brown's definition, it looks at the Islamic perspective from a late antique point of view, fundamentally. So this is also very important to remember, because objectively, the Arabs that started the Islamic invasions were a bunch of Bedouins. Let's be honest. They weren't actually they were a primitive people. They were tribesmen. They were semi-nomadic, and they came to encompass, however, territories that were way more advanced than them. But albeit they weren't in fact they're sedentary peoples, these military civilizations of Mesopotamia, of Egypt, etc. They still had gravitated historically around those worlds. So even the same Islamic religion is effectively something that recognizes the Abrahamic descendancy. The Muslims at this point were in pre-Islamic Arabia. I made a video about that if you're interested. They were effectively Jews, even Christians. These were lands that effectively had been at a crossroad of the ancient trade. Just yesterday we were talking about that, areas like the Sinai, or in fact the same Arabia, also the southern Arabia, that was way more advanced than the Hijazi and the region from which Muhammad started his religion, were effectively pretty advanced and pretty much in contact with the rest of the world. A world that in the Near East, especially in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, was one of the most culturally, intellectually, and philosophically advanced of the world at the time. The Byzantines were controlling, in fact, these areas of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt that they cared extremely about, because they were fundamentally rich areas, heavily urbanized, that knew civilization since millennia. They had been also back into the Roman Empire, the most, at least economically and culturally dynamic in many ways. And it's actually not a surprise that they fell into the Arab hands so easily. Actually, this is another thing that we will see now that can't be conceived. I mean, as can't look at the Islamic invasions like mere invasions, like that were effectively a guy that purportedly vanquished everyone that was in the middle from between Arabia and the Pyrenees. Obviously and renownedly, the Islamic Empire in these lands was built because the local populations fundamentally massively supported the Islamic advance. And these were, in fact, largely Christian populations that at a certain time preferred even to stay under the Muslims as Christians than under other powers effectively. Naturally, it wasn't something pleasant in itself. This was still a conquest. It was brutal, as all invasions, etc. But still, it's very naive and simplistic to pretend that at a certain point these Bedouins popped out of the Arab desert and conquered the civilized world just on the point of their swords, because just as counting on the military factor as the only one. Naturally, there was internally to the Islamic movement at this time a relative cohesion, a great commitment a moral, a zealous character, if you want, that helped them, but still they could have not gone anywhere if there hadn't been systemic factors that effectively allowed them to take control of certain territories that, and you can't in fact read that just as, the Byzantine Empire and Persia were exhausted, right? There is also a matter of saying, look at the populations, look at what they were doing. In the case, especially of the Byzantine provinces that fell into the Arab hands. First of all, there were several occasions in which the Byzantines could have stopped the Muslims. The narrative also that the Byzantines were completely exhausted and couldn't raise a knife against the Muslims and got conquered is also another gross misinterpretations. And not only the Byzantines were strong enough theoretically to repel the Islamic invasions, and they basically messed up things by themselves, but also just one defeat at that point of the rising Islamic religion that was pretty young at this time could have effectively disrupted the cohesion of the Arab armies that were still mostly made up at that moment of the conquest by people who were Islamic by name, but they were de facto pagans, and they would remain for quite a time. That seeing that this new god had brought them not to victory but defeat, they would have abandoned the enterprise and would have made collapse the same movement. So we would not know much about Islam in the first place, without mentioning that there were still many Arabs that Arabs proper that lived in Arabia that remained pagan even after Muhammad had extended Islam to the whole Arabian Peninsula, namely. So, and there is, trace of this that is pretty evident. And the history of Islam is particularly foggy at this point. Historically speaking, we study it through the traditions and the stories. Fundamentally, were written much later on the base of certain political and religious agendas, and had to stress certain things that are useful, obviously, to understand even the early times. But this is not really a moment in which we know much about that, as we don't know much about the same Byzantines or the Sassanids at the same time. I was starting to say that, of course, provinces of the southeastern provinces of the Byzantine Empire were effectively fed up with the Byzantine domination. They wanted to be autonomous, if not independent. They were, for this very reason, stressing also religious orientations within the same Christianity compared to Constantinople. So they didn't suffer Byzantine taxes that were pretty high. So they prefer, even actually the Muslim domination at this point required much less in terms of taxation, and left the local communities relatively free. The idea is that if you look also, we were talking about it when I discussed the military organization of the Caliphal armies in a recent video, that if you look at the attitude of these local populations, they immediately participated even to the same Islamic conquests. This is particularly evident when the Muslims created a fleet with which at the beginning of the 8th century even besieged Constantinople in itself. Now, besieging Constantinople at the time is not something you can do just so lightheartedly. The Muslims at this time had evidently developed certain logistical, technological, and engineeristic means that they obviously had learned from these local populations of the Near East. They had conquered, and they were way more advanced than them, but they had immediately assimilated them, and they were able to put under siege a city like Constantinople, and actually failing it, but not failing because of much probably of their poor organization, but on the contrary, because of Byzantine effectiveness. And just for saying that was arguably the most difficult city to besiege in Europe at that point, also probably also in the Near East and the other areas that the Muslims invaded, and they could achieve this only because the local fleets, the local shipyards, the local crews participated to this enterprise. The so-called Saracen piracy that is conceived as, these were just Muslims, bloodthirsty, thirsty of Christian blood and everything. It's renowned that at this time in the Mediterranean, during the so-called Saracen invasions, leaving aside the fact that many Saracens were Christians, and some of them came even from the same Byzantine Empire, but effectively there were lots of Christian pirates at the same time, also of other traders and sailors, and also the Jewish ones were pretty active. So even in here, looking at the thing just like, these were attacking because they were from that religion, doesn't explain why this happened in the first place. It's obvious that this were profanating, for instance, certain holy, think about St. Peter's and St. Paul's basilicas in Rome that were effectively raided by the Saracens at this point, and obviously there was a religious leading factor, ideally, and even formally sometimes, because when the Saracens made certain, not talking about the early Islamic advance, but probably the Saracen pirates, they made some conquests, they always asked a sort of political recognition to be recognized as a sort of a emirate or something in a Islamic fashion. But there might have been as well Christian Saracens at that point in there that effectively did it as all pirates in history do it, for that is making money and storing and praying, etc. So I'm saying this because this is today actually in history something largely unknown. I mean, nobody should be particularly surprised of this. Surely in academies we don't believe it's something strange, but if you say certain things out there, you will find always the one who says, this is just ideology, this is leftist garbage and all this stuff, but it's objectively not. And if you can go beyond this ideological attitudes and even reasoning without blinkers, fundamentally, you can reach actually pretty satisfying results with your intellectual development, because you realize that not only it's not like that, but it's way more complex than that. And this doesn't mean to diminish, in fact, the religious struggle that existed, but it was fundamentally framed in two dynamics that were much more concrete, like effectively defending a local community because of political interests, because of social interests, because of economy, trade, etc. And as we saw, especially on that video on the Saracens I made recently, it's called Rethinking the Saracens or something like that. You realize that the same growth of the Christian naval powers in the Mediterranean, etc., actually started in the haven of this largely Islamic-controlled Mediterranean, actually, and that there was always a great, also complicity sometimes, but certain Christian powers and the local Saracens also, because of trade, because effectively they made between a war and another that are something relatively rare. These people continuously traded and continuously profited the one from the other. So this goes along with so many things about encapsulation. We've seen that encapsulation many times was just something really temporary, when it was really an emergential thing dictated by these invasions, and that as a matter of fact, the greatest part of, massively, the encapsulation of Europe happened just exactly the era after the Saracen invasions. So not during the moment. The same goes for the Vikings, for the Hungars, etc. Actually proving in that case that that during the second invasions, definitely things were not very good. There weren't many resources to build castles, permanent castles, and the few ones that were built were actually most of the times built because of logics of internal domination of the same European territories, because of the local lords that had intermittently to do with invasions, and were effectively thinking first and foremost about their own aggrandizement and empowerment on the at the local level. So you can say, well, yeah, but still this Islamic empire really expanded pretty fast, pretty much, and they launched massive campaigns and operations and invasions. Absolutely, yes. Nobody is trying to deny that at all. And this expansion was actually pretty dramatic in itself. In the period in which the first four lieutenants of the Prophet, so in fact in Arab the caliphs proper, were ruling, the Islamic conquerors tried at least to maintain, for instance, a certain separation between, in fact, the conquerors and the vanquished. And it was effectively, a military expanded rule. Early Islam was expanded effectively through arms, and this is undeniable. Also, there was a sort of spectacular character of this. I mean, in fact, we were saying before, the same religious ideology was stressing the military glory of this movement of Islam in itself. So the Islamic tradition took a lot of pride because of these conquests, especially like the Middle Eastern and North African regions. And this was the moment of glory, like the golden age of Islam. Then eventually, of Islam, well, of course, you can extend it considering especially the power of the Umayyads, the Abbasids, but I'd say that there is this initial phase. It was the phase of the heroes, effectively. Then in the second phase, that starts actually pretty quickly, pretty early, like between the 661 and 750. You have instead the Umayyad dynasty that gave a final kind of political unity and orthodoxy, at least they tried to spread it, in establishing their capital in the Syrian city of Damascus. And this is a moment in which the Islamic rulers began to losing this character, this political direction of separation, if you want, and they start to give way to, to start certain policies of integration. I don't know how to say this, explain it better, but this is the moment in which, to explain it more structurally, there had been these Arabs that had expanded. How many could they ever been? This is also important. The highlands from which the early Arabian rulers conquerors had come from weren't effectively very much populated. Were semi-arid, if not desertic areas. The Arabs were a few. So another prejudice that exists out there, that somewhat everything that is Islamic is Arab. This is absolutely not true. The only Arab thing that exists in Islam is effectively the language. The rest is a mix of many other elements that effectively were created even after the Arab conquest, and at that point didn't quite belong to the Arabian origins anymore. And why is that? Because the Arabs were very few. Even the ethnic impact that the Arab invasions had were pretty small, actually. Regions like Arabia, especially also North Africa, simply didn't have the demographic potential to have a substantial influence on the European demographics. This is widely known. I mean, Europe influenced ethnically places like North Africa way more, massively more than North Africa could ever do. So what happened is that basically we don't talk about Arabs proper, but about Arabicide elites, which means that when we talk about powers like, I don't know, the Umayyads of Spain, or the Aghlabids of Tunisia, or the Fatimids of Egypt, we're not talking effectively about Arabs. We're talking about Islamicized and peoples with Arabicide elites and nothing else, which means that most of what we define as Saracens effectively had nothing to do with the Arabs, ethnically speaking. And of course, actually, during the this first phase, the Islamic world was pretty much dynamic and in contact one with the other. So we can't deny that there were effectively many exchanges, many blendings fundamentally into the same Islamic world, and therefore also in the regions where the Muslims were ruling. So I don't know, if you look about the Islamic schools of thought, the schools of law, actually, you see that there were in very strict contacts between, I don't know, places like Yemen and Spain, or Tunisia and Syria. So there were leaders that effectively, when the caliphate was still united, were sent as administrators, as military leaders here and there across the Mediterranean, etc. But this doesn't, however, mean that the local populations were fundamentally Arab. And as we've seen also in the video on the military organization of the caliphate, the Arabs began quite immediately, I would say, if not, they already were used to do it in part, to use foreign troops, sometimes even in large numbers. So we're talking about we're talking about the Gulams, right? So the Turks, but if you look at North Africa, lots of black Africans or Berber populations. Think about after the Umayyads, think about the Almohads or the Almoravids, etc. These were all peoples from the Moroccan Atlas and other regions far south that effectively had nothing to do with the Arabs historically, and if not the fact that they were Islamic, or partially, because, by the way, that's also what it was. Don't think that when you think about Islam expanding now, it was something so quick. It wasn't Christianity. It still had troubles to kind of evangelize the continent of Europe. Had actually a much deeper, much more widespread effect on the local populations, and that was still relatively superficial. You can imagine in the Islamic world how it was like, especially on these populations of the Maghreb, but also much also in the Middle East, especially places like Persia that maintain a very strong character of very autonomous, very local character, even in thought, in ideologies, and sects of Islam that effectively recognize that you can recognize still Manichaeism, and this is typical also of certain Shiite sects, etc. So the unity of Islam is actually a myth in this perspective. Europe, if you look at medieval Europe, was definitely a very fragmented world, and it was, but there is no comparison in terms with the Islamic one. Europe was way more homogeneous in all its complicated nature than effectively the Islamic world. The Islamic world was immediately extremely diverse, extremely differentiated, and that's why on the long run, it came to, to fundamentally to crumble, politically speaking, because aside from this new religion and this initial sense of belonging of the Arab or Arabized elites, fundamentally all these populations had nothing in common, and that's why the caliphate effectively split up into a series of other powers that were often even hostile one among the other, and the Muslims kept even fighting massively against themselves, just like the Christians were doing, and the same time in which we think, in fact, that it was, Christians versus Muslims, right? It wasn't effectively like that. At this point, the basic criterion was, who is your enemy, and you just fight with him. Doesn't matter what religion it is, because guess what? That's what is convenient to do in a competitive world, and thinking about just ideal factors is pretty lame. Definitely, there was there was, first of all, a further expansion of the Islamic world, for which the Muslims arrived up to the Indus River, and in the west there is the completion of the Maghrebin conquest. There is the conquest of Spain and even of southern France. But in the two following centuries, you have this other great phase from 750 to 945. That is the moment of glory of the Abbasid dynasty, that became effectively the Caliphate dynasty. Even though at this point it never achieved what the Umayyads of the early days of the early hour had managed to do, that is having this, at least nominally and formally, political unity and their universal dominion, at least in fact theoretically intended. Partly because the Umayyads kept surviving into Spain when the when the Abbasids were developing. Also because they shifted their position, they shifted the capital to Baghdad, that was to become effectively the most advanced city in the world at this point, and ruling from this strictly Mesopotamian dimension, right? Even if the Abbasid power extended on other areas like partly of Persia, or Egypt, or Syria, but the bulk of power of the Abbasids was Mesopotamia, which is incidentally what the bulk of power of all empires that had gravitated around that area had been. So sometimes we like also to stress, in fact, the discontinuity that the Islamic world brought, right? So that's why I'm not actually very in agreement with those phrases talking about the revolution. Like, this great change. Yeah, it was a massive change, but it didn't actually revolutionize a big deal of things, because guess what? This was, it was an Islamic empire, but the deal is not that it was Islamic. The deal it was an empire. And guess what? Empires do exactly the same thing that every other empire do. They try to extend their power, they launch military offensives, the campaigns, they try to conquer neighboring, and they try just to remain in shape, and they have internal problems and they crumble. There are dynasties who rise to the top and then they're overthrown, and that's in a nutshell the history of all humanity in many ways. And the Muslims were doing the same exact thing, and they were doing it on the base of other of other civilizations at that point. As we were saying before, the Arab element goes diluted at this point. It's effectively not about the Arabs anymore. It's effectively about the Mesopotamians, the Syrians, the Egyptians, the Tunisians, the Spanish. This is what it practically was. And this is important because if you take these chunks of the caliphate and you realize that you see how they autonomized and they started effectively even fighting one against the other, you realize that there is a great logic for such repartitions. I mean, all of these regions had been the base of kind of powers that had a local base that was mostly an agricultural base. Guess why where this happened? In Mesopotamia, this renownedly one of the most fertile areas ever. Into Egypt, the same. Tunisia, that is one of the only fertile areas of North Africa. Spain, that is, especially in the south, massively fertile. And that's where this local dynasts start building their own empires and trying to expand from there. This is interesting also because you see how definitely, yes, Islam had a capacity to combine certain elements together to create something original, an original synthesis if you want, but it's still built on bases that were effectively already there. Also, in terms of knowledge, of technology, and advancements, the first thing the Muslims did was to treasure actually all the Hellenic and Roman manuscripts that the Byzantines treasured in the Near East. The fact that the Muslims burned down books and manuscripts actually that time is a myth. Is a myth that was built by the same Muslims to say basically that especially the Muslims of the first hour, that they wanted to read just the Quran, so that everything went destroyed, because that was a show off that they only read the Quran is the only read you have it. But that was just propaganda that they were making for themselves, while actually treasuring and avidly reading and learning from the ancient knowledge, ancient world. And we actually have the proof of this simply because we know that during Islamic times and throughout the Islamic conquest in lands that the Hellenistic world had not reached, for example, the Far East of Asia, there are suddenly certain traditions during the Middle Ages appearing, talking about the classical world, talking about Alexander, talking about faraway lands in like Iceland with the Arctic pole with the geysers, etc. That effectively were, well, okay, in the case of those explorations, were partly done by the Arabs and traders themselves, but this was all knowledge. It was also known since Hellenistic times that the Arabs were effectively they were emanating now from this world. Well, this is particularly fascinating. Seemingly, it's also a new frontier of research. I mean, to show that actually the Arabs knew a freaking lot of things about the ancient world that were able, by the way, to reapply in a way that the Byzantines had even kind of almost lost to doing, because the Arabs at this point were way more open-minded than Byzantines in many ways. And they effectively built their own civilization on the basis also of this knowledge. Always remember that after this very first impact of the first generation, or maximum two, the more primitive a people is, and the more open it actually is to culture. To external culture, fundamentally, the most resilient and resistant and positive cultures towards civilizations towards the foreign cultures are effectively the ones that are the most developed, because they just have a conservative view of knowledge, of the mental structures, of the ideas of how they are built and how they are accepted fundamentally. This is a matter of mindset. It's not a matter of political orientation. Well, it also effectively influences policy, but it has a deeper meaning. It's like a bit. This happened a bit to anyone. Think about the Romans, that were actually a very primitive people originally, and that expanded in an extremely fast way, so that they were able to synthesize and to create something original on their own. Partly the same Germans did, in different times and contexts naturally, but with astonishing results. Well, the same happened for the Arabs, and having come to rule, in fact, on the richest and most advanced regions of the world. This time they became the richest and most advanced civilization in the world at that time. And this is the point, because if you look what the Latin Germanic world was doing this time, it was very slowly trying to build something from the ashes to kind of restructure himself a bit, in a way that the Muslims basically rocketed to the stars at this point, and it did it extremely quickly. So in the case of the Abbasids, you have it more evidently. Baghdad, as we were saying before, became the most important city in the world. The empire, the caliphate, consolidated its own administration, had a centralized, in fact, state with a permanent army. It was an enormous power at this time, and the Europeans were very interested in them, especially if you think about Charlemagne and the diplomatic missions that existed between the Franks and the Arabs, the Abbasids in this case. Well, since the Franks didn't have very good relations with the Byzantines, they were effectively seeking for a sort of alliance with the Muslims to say, okay, we effectively share this side of the world and you the other one, for what they believed the world was, naturally, to try to keep the Byzantines out. And you say, oh well, but the Franks were fighting against the Muslims, right? Yeah, okay, but those were effectively the Muslims of Spain. Here we're talking about the Abbasids. There is not a monolithic Islam in here. There is not a monolithic world with one empire, one army that was all Muslim and it surrounded you. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. There were two completely different things. And effectively the Muslims were sweeping into France at this time weren't even actually Umayyad at this point. They were this smaller frontier kingdoms of northeastern Spain that were launching raid parties fundamentally into Aquitaine, into Occitania. And they were doing it on their own. There were many Christians within them as well, including the ones that effectively destroyed the Carolingian rearguard at Roncesvalles, that were, according to epics, were Muslims, but as a matter of fact, they were Basques, and they were, say, Christians, but barely, at that point in many ways. But still, these are the perspectives that matter, in my opinion, not the idea, there is a massive siege of Europe by the Muslims in that time. It's not really like that. It's not really like that. And there were effectively many Christian powers cooperating normally with the Muslims, not doing them like abscondedly, like, okay, no, we don't have to be sure. No, they were doing it normally all the time. Just like the Muslims were in fact doing with them. And so, however, I think that the most important thing to remember here is in fact that in the frame of this new empire, the caliphate, there is very soon the formation of kingdoms ruled by local dynasties that were destined to survive the same caliphate, or better, the unity of the same Arab-Islamic Empire, and that were to effectively create that legacy of the Arabicide world that we know still today. I think that this is the most important perspective because there is a prejudice that still stems from this cataclysmic and and catastrophic perception of the Islamic invasions. The idea that, the Muslims were just one big block. They weren't. There's also the myth that the Muslims finally, after millennia, reunited, recompacted politically areas like the Near East, the Middle East. It's the perfect opposite. As a matter of fact, Islamic conquest created a mess in terms of political unity that was never solved up to this day. because Islam immediately fragmented. I mean, as soon as it's finished to expand, like many other empires, began to crumble. And in the case of the Islamic world, this was even faster because because of this demic relation of strength that we have discussed before. This was just a very few Arabs, like how many we want them to have been in terms of actual warriors, tens of thousands, who conquered areas inhabited by tens of millions. How do you think that is possible? One against thousands. It's impossible without the support of those thousands that actually saw this situation to emancipate them, to emancipate themselves as an occasion to build something locally grounded, and that effectively happened in this way because the same Islamic conquerors were effectively settled in areas that they had to control by themselves. In order to control them, they necessarily had to share power with the local elites, and these local elites now maybe conformed to Islam. They started, they became Muslims. They started learning Arab and so on. But these were elites that belonged previously to other worlds: Syrians, Palestinians, Egyptians, Tunisians, Spanish, and these were people who Moroccans and people who had nothing to do with Arabs, nor with Islam previously. Naturally, they were Christian, maybe originally, and so this is something that actually happened very often in many other ages in history, but the case of the Muslim world, of the early Islamic conquests, presents very well, very clearly. And guess what? In Arabia, there was basically no empire. This is also another very interesting part. You have a power that emerges from an area that doesn't become an empire on its own. The Arabs weren't ruling from Arabia. They were ruling from now the places where they had effectively settled. Arabia remained a place with semi-nomads and Bedouins until the 20th century. Albeit nominally it was ruled by someone. But this thing of the political unity of those lands actually fragmented is with Islamic conquests is particularly important to understand. Chiefly, as I was saying before, because you can still see today what it was about. Secondly, because it's easy to figure out just looking at what the past had been. I mean, areas like the Near East and the Middle East were respectively had been ruled by the Romans and the Persians. And if you look before, there had been these major empires like the Seleucid Empire, the Alexandrian Empire, previously the Achaemenid Empire. So those were areas that had actually remained united under a single political ruler. With the Arab conquests, this lasts for a while, and we could also comment very much on the beginnings of this, because you can still, since the very beginnings, actually, the Islamic world is fragmented. Yeah, nominally, you can see, that there were the caliphs, the Umayyads, that theoretically conquered everything, but still, if you look in detail, you see that, the frontiers were practically already lost. It was it all worked to a decentralized administration. It was based on just the balance of arms, of military forces, where they could go, where they could arrive, etc. And it is true. There was also no other major opponent there. The Byzantines take some time before they can effectively strike back. And therefore these were just the Muslims dealing with their stuff, their internal stuff by themselves, and actually seriously messing up the whole system. And I was telling before the factor, the detrimental factor that the same relation with Islam and the political authority is about, because theoretically, that God should be the only earthly leader, right? So that that's why Shari'a is a divine law, and it differs so much from Christianity, and instead says, just like Judaism, that okay, yes, there is a divine law, but still, in this world, just know that you have to obey to the political authorities that exist there. So this is the origin of the division between church and state. In the Islamic world, there is nothing like that. You may think that this was actually a strength factor, like saying, if the two things overlap, everything should be way simpler. This wasn't simpler at all, because far from creating unity, every kind of political leader now could basically appeal to the Quran and its interpretation, and its there were many actually that could make him claim that he was the chosen leader. It was the Imam. It was effectively, and if you look, in fact, at the powers that were created, they were titling themselves as caliphs. It's as if, in the Western world, there had been several people who claimed themselves to be emperor. Actually, there weren't many. In medieval Europe, just within Germany, there were certain contested imperial elections between this German princes that kind of said, okay, I was elected, I wasn't, but that was a wholly another problem. In Islam, you have every once in a while political and military leader that pops out of sometimes out of literally of nowhere, that says, okay, I'm the leader, and there's a storm, an avalanche of people who follows him, and that they're able to crash other powers into of the same Islamic world and to take over. So the Fatimids are a case like this, that they basically started from the deserts of Tunisia and Libya, and they came to conquer Egypt and to form one of the most powerful Islamic powers at the time. And religious problems were many. Even the same Sunni orthodoxy that was basically the winning side, but at the beginning it still couldn't stem, for instance, the expansion of Shia Islam, and even the same Abbasid Caliphate consistently to become a Shia power at a point. This is particularly fascinating, also because the ideas traveled, people studied. It was an extremely intellectually dynamic world. So when you combine this with political fragmentation and this sense of of distrust sometimes towards the local political authority for religious reasons, well, here you have the effect, the result. You have a situation that is extremely fluid, and okay, well, certain powers naturally remained for centuries to pretty relatively solid, etc. But the Islamic world was extremely complex and especially extremely intertwined, for which it wasn't just about a regional perspective or dimension that counted, but also the relations, the internal religious movements, ideas, sects, etc. And if you think that medieval Christianity with all the heresies, etc., is complicated, just study medieval Islam. It's a total mess of so many different branches. It was incredible. Different schools of law, different philosophy, etc. And however, interestingly enough, there are similarities even in here between the Latin Germanic world, the Byzantine one, and the Islamic one, that are, for instance, there is still this idea of the orthodoxy that is generally pushed by the authorities, the most powerful authorities. There are this kind of secondary movements that are considered heretic. They're in fact way more heterodox, and they are all influenced by the old Manichaeistic philosophies. This is what you find with the Qadars in Western Europe. We find it with Bogomilis in the Byzantine Empire. That's we find with certain Shia sects in Persia. So it's and everywhere actually in the Islamic world. So many scenarios, also monastic orders exist, albeit with some difference, but in the base, not enormously in the Christian and in the Islamic world. So you can also interpret this as a sort of structural phenomenon of the whole Eurasian world during the Middle Ages that brings to political fragmentation because of the because of certain environmental factors, chiefly general crisis, economical, demographic crisis that these powers throughout the medieval centuries are progressively trying to rise from, and to create something more powerful. And you have in the Islamic world a much higher dynamism that at this point between the 7th and 10th century compared, in fact, to other areas of Eurasia, that will, however, in my opinion, in part remain chronicle in many ways, so that at the end of this period, after the 10th century, you realize that, for instance, Europe is on the rise, and at this point in the Islamic world also grows in part, but it's still a bit more, it remains unstable. It's not able to fix its balance. Also the urban communities of areas that had been previously actually pretty much urbanized and dynamic, economically speaking, regress. They don't make it to become like the great coastal cities of the Christian Mediterranean that expand, become commercial trade powers with great autonomy and entrepreneuriality. The Islamic world in this also makes the urban life partly sclerotizing. It's similar to the Byzantine one in certain ways, and it's effectively interesting to think about it, especially when you compare those coastal those urban centers had been in the ancient world. If you think about Brown's definition, you see that he thought of Islam in this sense to have expanded into an ancient world. So in that ancient world, places like the Eastern Mediterranean were way more advanced economically, urbanistically, demographically than the Western Europe. After the 10th century, the tides turn. It's Western Europe that rises and that is able to overwhelm both the Byzantine and the Islamic world in the Mediterranean. And this is pretty meaningful because it means that something had changed. And I discussed a little bit this and try to explain it in a video that I think is called Franks and Arabs to Empires Compared, in which I observed that, in fact, in spite of the relative, not actually very relative backwardness of the Carolingian Empire compared to the Abbasid Caliphate, you see that effectively the Carolingians set in motion with the vassalic beneficiary system a world that started growing, while the Islamic world that in these previous times had been the most advanced, the center of science, of civilization, of technology, of philosophy, etc., of economy, effectively slows down and is not able to go much further, and it takes other powers effectively like historically to make it take an extra step. I'm talking chiefly about the Ottomans from the late medieval times onwards, but even in that case you see that Europe keeps evolving, and at that time still the difference is not quite evident. Actually, if you take even in the late medieval period, powers like the Mamluks, etc., were actually pretty substantial power, but at the same time they also basically collapsed, they crumble Europe, albeit very slowly, but it sets certain bases that are way more solid, and therefore are able eventually to, during the modern age, to effectively take over the world, and also to intervene into the Islamic world, and to demolish it, and to create, in part, also those that to revive at least that enmity that had characterized this part of the Middle Ages, that, however, was mostly characterized, I would say, by pacific relations between Christians and Muslims than it would happen later in some ways. But this is also conjectural, because it's difficult. It's actually not very useful to talk about a clash of civilizations, or a clash of religions when looking at these two powers, because they had a lot in common, also culturally speaking. They were studying from the same authors of antiquity. They were effectively all monotheisms. They were coming from, if you look at the Christian world, the Jewish world, the Islamic world in the Middle Ages, they were coming to similar conclusions. Aristotelism was studied in the same ways. Actually, it was the Muslims that effectively brought back to Europe Aristotle, and made the Europeans fall in love with those that Islamic reinterpretation of Aristotle, and triggering scholastics, etc., Aquinas. But even if you look at Maimonides in the Jewish world, it's the equivalent in many ways. So perspectives that I hope are useful to understand the complexity of a relation that is too often, and ridiculously, I would say, approximated by saying, it was effectively a war of religions, a clash of religions. Not even the Crusades were a religious war, effectively. And this is also very difficult to explain. Maybe I will do it in another video, because it's an important topic to discuss. At this time, this is also another perspective that it can be useful, is that making a political and military action in the name of a religion is the grade zero of the story. Like, every single power at this time was effectively fighting for its own religion. There wasn't even one that didn't say, okay, we're just invading this place because we think we need it aside from our religions. No, it was always in the name of God, and it was so standard that you realize that you can't use it as a paradigm to define those words, because even if it was so important for them, effectively that always happened. And if you look at the dynamics, you observe that what effectively makes the difference is that the grade of interests that existed, like at all times, the kind of economical dimension of conflicts, and when you look at religion, you say, okay, yeah, culturally might have been influenced, it might have even fueled partly the moral resources, etc. But if there hadn't been religion, there would have been something else to motivate them. And it's still what happens today. We are not debating in very different ways, actually, from the ones of fundamentalistic ideologies today. So if you look at medieval world, you would probably be amazed to observe how everything was done made in the name of God, but at the same time, it was recognized that there was a dimension that normally went beyond that. And that people were not fanatically oriented towards religion, like saying, I do this just because it's written in my holy book. This is a modernistic perspective of the story that has been built during the Enlightenment, that wanted to demonize the Middle Ages as an age of obscurantism, dominated by irrationality that allegedly a religion is supposed to symbolize. But it wasn't like that, and this in turn, in fact, triggered other and arguably even worse ideologies that brought to the 20th century we know to what. Sometimes in the name of lay, let's say, of secularity, of secularism. Think about communism, just for one thing. I mean, I believe that there can't be any proportion between the destructions brought by such ideas and the ones of the Middle Ages. Albeit, this still was always a violent world, because guess what? We are always the same people. We're always the same humans. So if you don't have one ideology for killing someone, you can find as many other as you like to replace it. And it will always be like this, as a matter of fact. But we will be more punctual maybe on another occasion. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I don't remember what I have to say. I just hope that whatever. I wish you a nice. I thank you heartily for listening to me. This is what I usually say. Yes. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.